My name's David Byland. I'm a leathersmith. I live in Hoover, Alabama now, but I've lived all over the United States. I think we've moved 7 times in the 42 years we've been married. The journey in leather itself began in Oklahoma, but I would say for me in some ways it begins before that. I grew up working on a farm, learning to make the things that we needed to use on the farm. If something was broken, we couldn't just go buy a new one. And so I learned woodworking, I learned metalworking, I learned all kinds of things that were dealt with working with your hands and the value of working with your hands. I was an artist from as young as I can remember. I was drawing, I was doodling, I was making pictures, crazy looking animals, things like that. By the time I got to college, I was doing graphic design for the theater department, for the film festivals that we had. And so art's always been sort of my go-to relaxation. But when I started teaching, a lot of that sort of fell by the wayside in terms of my finding a way to have personal release through art. You know, teaching, as you know, takes a lot of your time. It's not just what happens in the classroom, it's what happens in your office, it's what happens at home as you prepare. And when we moved to Oklahoma, we had 3 daughters, and we knew that at some point we needed to just find ways to relax, ways to put our workday aside completely. Camping for us was a way to do that as a family. We would go out to, I'll never forget the first time we went camping in Oklahoma. We went to the Wichita Mountain Wildlife Refuge, and they have free-range bison, longhorn cattle, elk, and their campgrounds are in an area where you may find one or more of those animals sort of walking through at any time. And one morning I heard that rumbling sound. I heard that you almost feel the rumbling sound that bison make. There's a deep, I don't want to say grunting, but just a sound that says, you know, I'm here. You can just feel it. And as I looked out of the tent, I saw a small herd of bison moving through the campground, and actually had startled a poor guy who was on his way to the bathhouse with his towel and his shorts and things. And suddenly there's the bison, and he, you know, of course, ran back where he had come from. But there was a sense of wildness, but also peacefulness. I felt observing them. And so that in one sense is sort of where this idea of the bison, the West, it's sort of congealed for me. I grew up loving Westerns. I watched Western TV shows with my grandfather. I would sit on his chair. He was a smoker, and he would there puffing on his cigarettes, watching Gunsmoke on a Saturday night, and I would sit with him, and I really enjoyed that. Enjoyed Bonanza. Enjoyed any Western show that I could see. As all those things started to sort of come together, and I can't really point to a time where I sat down and said, "Aha, this is what I want to do." I think it was one of those things where here's an element. As I moved to Oklahoma, I experienced a kind of West that I'd only seen growing up on television. And as I became more aware of the Western culture in Oklahoma, we would go to the Cowboy Hall of Fame, Western Heritage Museum and Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City often. We'd take the girls and we'd go. And I would look at the saddles, I would look at the holsters, I would look at the gear that the cowboys used, that they had there. And I was amazed at the intricacy of the designs in the leather, especially on the saddles. And looking at those saddles, I thought, what an amazing thing to be able to do, to sort of capture nature and movement and growth in a somewhat abstract form sometimes very realistic. And I thought that would really be an interesting skill to have. Then we add to that art shows that we would go to as patrons, and I would see leather work that was there. One thing that stands out in my mind was a sketchbook, a leather sketchbook with paper, hand bound, and I'm looking at that and I thought, I bet I could make that. And so that's the first thing I tried to make in leather was learning how to do long stitch binding, how to fold the paper, to get everything together, and then do the stitching with the leather. Then I made a knife sheath for a knife that I'd made. I made this knife, and you can't just buy a knife sheath off the shelf for a custom-made knife. So I thought, well, I'll make that. And I started to realize I really enjoyed working with leather. And I'd done a lot of woodworking, a lot of photography. So I had other hobbies. But as I began to explore leather, I began to really find a love for that. Going to those museums and things and thinking, well, I'm going to try that. I'm going to see if I can do what I'm seeing on the saddles. I can't build a saddle. That was beyond my capability, but can I do that pattern? So I started getting books. This was before everything could be found on the internet. I bought books. I sat down. I made drawings. I followed instructions, and I got to the point where I felt like this is not bad. This is getting pretty good. And so from there, the journey just sort of evolved. I guess I've probably been doing leather work for myself, my family, for 4 or 5 years. And my wife said, you ought to try and sell it on Etsy. I said, well, what's Etsy? And so she explained it to me. I got on Etsy and I put some things on and I sold a few things. And I thought, well, this is pretty amazing. So I put some more things on and sold some more things. And then people started asking me to make things for them. And so it gradually became something that I did as a hobby that sustained itself, which I feel pretty fortunate, because a lot of people who have hobbies, they don't sustain themselves. If you do train sets as a hobby, you can't charge admission to your grandchildren to come in and play with the train. So I was able to sustain that hobby, and also I've had an outlet for myself to sort of get away from the technology of the world that I lived in day to day. As a teacher, teaching broadcasting, digital media, I spent every day using technology and trying to figure out ways to apply that technology to communicate. Being around technology all day long made me want to sort of release myself from its grasp when I had my own time to myself. And leatherwork was a way to do that. I don't use any machines. I don't have a sewing machine. I don't have a laser engraver. I don't have any of the sort of machines that you would find in a lot of the modern leather shops. I do everything by hand. It's quiet in my shop unless I have my radio playing music, which I don't very often. I hear the birds singing. I can look out my window and see the trees and the sunshine. It's a chance for me to be alone and focus on the work of my hands, focus on taking the vision in my head and putting it onto the leather. For me, really became like I said, sort of a release from that day-to-day experience of teaching, of technology. I do use specialized tools for leather work, and I think one of the most important ones is called a swivel knife, and that's this tool right here, and it has a small yoke on the top. Your finger goes in, and you actually cut the leather with this very fine blade. You cut the pattern into the leather. Once you've done that, you use a variety of tools to impress the design into the leather. One of the questions I get asked often is, how do you carve the leather? Or do you carve the leather? Is it like wood carving? And it's not like wood carving. You're compressing the leather. You're not taking anything away from it. You wet the leather, you let the water soak into the fibers, sometimes for an hour, depending on the thickness, sometimes overnight. Once it's saturated, we call that casing. Once it's cased, the leather has a cool feel to it. If you touch it to your cheek, it should feel cool. Then I can cut it. Then I use a tool called a beveler, a beveling tool, to go around the outline that I've carved. This is an example of something that's been cut with the swivel knife, and some of the beveling has been started. You can see I've followed the lines that I've drawn on the leather to create the design. Then I go in with, in this case, it's called a lifter or an undershot beveler, sort of lift up the leather. This is an example of a backgrounding tool, which is simply a matter of pressing the leather down further. So you're creating layers in the leather. You push some back as far as you can. You have some in the middle ground, and then you pull some up into the foreground. You use tools like this, which is a shader, pear shader. This one has lines on it, so as I tap it with this tool in the leather, it creates a indentation, but it also creates a sort of burnishing effect. So it really, tooling leather is about doing this a lot. That's what you'll hear a lot. I've got a large granite countertop that I tool on so that it's solid, it doesn't bounce, and tap, tap, tap all day long to create things. So it goes from, well, actually it goes from something like this, which is just a simple drawing of what I might like to put on the leather, to that, which is the cut in using the swivel knife, to then something like this, which is completed in terms of the tooling that needs to be done. I've cut it in, I've used the backgrounding tool, I've done the shading, I've done the lifting, and so this is now ready to oil and then to color. When I do the coloring on the leather, for me, I always like to create contrast. I like to create between the background and the foreground a very deliberate kind of contrast that allows the design to stand out, also gives it maybe a bit more of a sense of age and that kind of thing. And to do that, for example, on this piece, what I will do is I will use this paintbrush, which is very thin, very fine tip paintbrush. I will dip it into my black dye or dark brown dye, whatever I'm using, and I'll simply touch it to the background, and each drop, capillary action, will pull it through the background, and I'll go around the whole background doing that until eventually I have the whole background colored in black or dark brown, whichever I'm using. And this is the sort of thing that you end up with at the end of that process. I've done all the background dyeing, then I've gone over top with brown dye, and then I've antiqued it. Like some painters will use a resist. I use a resist to do my antiquing. Once it's tooled and dyed, I put a resist on it over the top so that when I rub my antique paste into the design and then wipe it off, all of the nice brown dye stays, but where the resist didn't have an impact, that antique gets into the nooks and crannies and grain of the tooling. One of the things I've found about doing it that way is that you're going to make mistakes. When I dye the background, you can imagine when I'm using a little brush like this and I dip into my dye, I have one nice drop of dye on this brush. I bring it over to put on my piece of leather. Every time, at least once during that process, it drops where I don't want it. What do? For me, that was one of the hardest things to come to grips with, because my wife tells me I'm a perfectionist. And so when I see that drop of black, that little tiny drop of black dye somewhere I don't want it, I have to remember this is a handmade piece. That's part of the process. And ultimately, when it's done, I'm the only one who knows where that happened. And so, when it's dyed, when it's antique, it disappears. So part of my journey has been to learn to overcome my sense of it has to be perfect to be right. That's not true. It has to be the best I can do to be right for me. Anything that I tool is going to be done in cowhide, because the way the cowhide is tanned allows it to be tooled. It's a vegetable tanning process, so they use oak bark and other vegetable matter in the tanning to create a surface that can be manipulated in tooling. Bison leather is not tanned that way. Bison leather is tanned using oils and other kinds of processes, and I'm not an expert on tanning at all. But the way bison leather is tanned, it can't be tooled. So I use bison leather with my tooled work as sort of accenting one another, complementing one another. For example, this piece with the sunflowers will be an accent piece on a clutch, a lady's clutch that I'm going to make. And so it will be on the front cover of the clutch. The rest of it will be made from black bison leather. And so this will be colored. I'm going to try to use some browns and golds and dark greens in here, as well as the antiquing. And so there'll be this combination of the two leathers, I think, that makes some of my work unique. I feel like I've gotten to the point where I'm fairly happy with what I do 90% of the time, because I wouldn't say mastered, but I'm accomplished enough in what I do to know where I'm most likely to make a mistake and maybe avoid that. That said, there was a piece that I was working on that was similar to this. This is going to be a large portfolio. And so you can see it's 20 inches by 13 inches, something like that. And the one that I was working on was carved completely over. I've gotten almost all of it done, was working on this last part of a panel, and I really messed up right in the center of the front panel. And I was told one time by another leather artist that the mark of a good craftsman is being able to work with his mistakes. What do you do with it to not cover it up, but incorporate it into what you're doing so that no one sees the mistake? And there's a lot of truth in that. But sometimes the mistake is so big and so glaring that there's nothing you can do. You can't save that piece. I have to set it aside. And I still have that particular piece in my studio just as a reminder, that I need to be more focused sometimes than I was on that particular day. I'm not an abstract artist, and I wish I was, because I think there's a certain amount of freedom in that kind of art that my personality needs more of. And so I think I get too caught up sometimes in the precision of what I impose on myself. I think, and part of that's also the type of work that I do. I make things that I want people to use. I want them to last a long time. I don't want someone to come back to me and say, this thing that I bought from you broke. It doesn't work anymore. I think for me, the difference would be between the visual art that is to evoke a meaning and to look at it and to feel some kind of an emotion, some kind of awareness of the world that you didn't feel before, maybe, as opposed to this tooled tote that someone's using at the market, and suddenly a strap breaks off of it. Now, they look at the tote, they like it, they love the tooling, and it gets an emotion, but when the strap breaks, there's a different emotion, one that I didn't want them to have. And so there is that sort of pressure, I think, that I feel, and I don't know if other leathersmiths feel it or not, but I certainly do.
It's like becoming from an extrovert and introvert. And now you have your world that only you understand.
That's very true. I mean, you've echoed exactly what my wife has said. She said, I think you've become an introvert. And that's interesting because I never saw myself as introverted. As a boy, as a young man, I was an actor. I was a theater major. I was always, in front of people, performing, doing things. I love being with people. My daughters would joke, we'd go camping in the middle of nowhere and be on top of some mountain, and that we'd hear somebody say, "Hey, Dave," and we'd look and there's someone I knew. Everywhere I went, we'd see somebody I knew. I think for the past several years, as I've gotten more focused on leather work and it's become more of my work instead of my hobby, it's true that I've become more introverted. And I think the thing that allows me to escape what might possibly be the negative effects of that is that I do shows where I take my work, I set up a booth, and I meet people. And I spend a half a day or 2 days or 3 days talking to people, explaining what I do to people, sometimes doing demonstrations for them, and getting that connection with people. But I don't mind spending time alone in my studio. If I'm down there for 6 or 8 hours a day working on several projects, I'm fairly happy. I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything. But I think if I only sold online, I think then I would really run the risk of going from introvert to maybe misanthrope, because I wouldn't see anyone at all. It would only be me all the time. So that wouldn't be good. In Birmingham, it's the biggest farmers market in Alabama, and they bring artisans in, and it's every Saturday. And of course, the artisans don't participate every Saturday because there's so many of us. We sort of rotate through. I have probably 10 or 12 slots this year. But I'll go tomorrow and set up around 6 a.m. and at 7 people will start coming in, and it will be a constant flow of people until noon when we pack up and go home. That's the farmers market. I also do other art shows that are juried art shows. So the artists apply, we send photographs, we send our artist statements, and we'll be selected or not, depending on the quality of our work and what the judges are looking for. And I do probably 4 or 5 of those a year. I've cut back quite a bit. I was probably up to about 20 shows a year at one point. But the shows, the art shows specifically, are difficult because it includes traveling, sometimes a day or 2 travel, includes overnight stays, taking my tent, setting it up, rain or shine, hauling my stuff around. So as I've gotten older, it's become a little more difficult to do a lot of those shows. But again, it's why I do the leather work, so that I can sell these things to people that can use them, but also to engage with the people. I think that's, for me, one of the really unique things about this is that I get to engage with the end user. It's not like I take my stuff to a store and leave it and walk away and get a check later from the store on some sort of commission. I meet the people who purchase it. They come back every time that I'm at a show. They'll be back to visit, to say hello, a lot of them. I'll get people come in, hey, I bought this wallet from you 10 years ago. Look at it. It's still great. That's what I really enjoy about it, is seeing that people are pleased with what they've purchased from me, because I spent the time and the energy and the focus to do it right. And that's meaningful to them. I don't know a lot of other leather workers in this area. There are a lot of people. Let me say this. I will say that during the pandemic, I noticed that on some of the leather sites that I follow, that a lot of people started getting involved in making leather. And part of that was in making leather goods. Part of that was facilitated by pattern makers who were selling online. They would create a pattern for a tote bag or a wallet. And because people were home and had some time on their hands, they were buying these patterns. The pattern maker would make a video tutorial, and people could, obviously you can order your leather and needles and so on over the internet. It gets delivered. They follow the tutorial, they follow the pattern, they make a wallet. That excites people. I created this thing with my own hands. It's useful. I like it. My wife likes it. My kids like it. I want to do another thing like this. And so there's been an enormous growth, I think, in leather work interest. To me, it appears worldwide by looking at some of these groups. People, Eastern Europe, Russia, UK, France, everywhere. People are commenting on how they love these patterns and things. So in that sense, I think there's a real, maybe a resurgence in the interest in using leather as a medium to create useful objects. And then some folks are then taking their intrinsic artistic talent and embellishing those patterns and saying, well, I bought this pattern, but then I painted this on it, or I learned how to tool a flower and I put that on there, or I embedded gemstones into the leather because I like that look. So I think there's people finding that leather has an availability to anyone who has an artistic vision. It will give itself to you in that vision and allow you to use it. I think we're seeing people understand that leather's something that can be used to express yourself. The museums that have taken my stuff have sold it in their shops, so it's not necessarily in any collection in a museum. But I do have people who've purchased items from me that they have in their homes, and it's a part of their personal collection. I always tell Laura, my wife, I always tell her I'm amazed that something that I sat down and said, I have an idea, and I would like to make this idea come to life in leather. I want to create this thing. And I do it, and I find so much satisfaction in it. You know, even though there's oftentimes frustration and problem solving and puzzling things out. I spend a lot of time puzzling things out. And then I get it done, and someone says, that has enough meaning to me that I'm willing to accept the monetary value you've placed on it and exchange that for that piece. I'm amazed by that. I just don't think I can express how mind-boggling it is to me that, you know, I can walk away from a transaction like that and say, you know, this is, what a blessing. I feel like I've been very blessed to be given an ability that brings me joy and also brings me a kind of peace in the doing of it, but also brings something to other people, whatever that may be. I think that's a real blessing, and I don't take that for granted at all. It really is an awesome kind of thing in the best way.
What would you say was the hardest artwork you have done so far?
In a way, it's sort of like I cut the tip of my finger off a couple months ago when I was working on a project and I was hurrying. And I went to the doctor and he said, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your pain? And I can never answer that question because I don't know how to reference that on a scale of 1 to 10. I don't. And so on the terms of what's the hardest piece that I've done, I don't know that I can answer that. I think anytime I do a custom piece, it's difficult because I have to understand what the customer wants, what the client wants, and I have to translate that into something I can do. Working with a custom order is often difficult because I've got to come up with a pattern, a design. I've got to meet the functionality that the client wants. So that can be difficult, but I don't think I would view anything that I've done as the hardest. It's probably the sort of pat answer to that would be, well, whatever's next will be the hardest. It just depends on what it is, I guess.
The viewers might wonder, what do people want?
I do sell a lot of portfolios, the tooled portfolios. I do get requests for custom items. You know, such a variety, which is another thing I like about it. Pipe rolls, knife sheaths, refillable books. I do get requests for holsters. Those are the sorts of things that I'll get. I sometimes get requests for things I haven't made before. Someone asked me to make handles, leather handles for his custom cabinetry that he was having installed in his house. And he said, I don't have any particular idea what I want it to look like. You just come up with something and that'll be great. So I get a nice variety of things. I think when I go to markets, there are certain things that sell at markets that I can always count on. I can always count on selling totes and journals, refillable notebooks, utilitarian things that people will be able to use over and over for a long period of time. But the custom orders, it's just such a variety. It would be hard to say that there's any one kind of category, really. That's interesting. I find him to be a fascinating individual for a lot of reasons. I mean, personally, I think he sort of embodies America at the turn of a century where it was sort of experiencing a new sense of itself, and his sort of wonder at the natural world. I got interested in Teddy Roosevelt when I was in the play Arsenic and Old Lace. And I don't know if you're familiar with that play, but it's about a boarding house that's run by two elderly women, and they take in lonely gentlemen, and they offer them elderberry wine, which is laced with arsenic. And then the elderly gentleman dies, and they put him out of his misery. And their brother, who thinks he's Teddy Roosevelt, buries them in the Panama Canal, which is in the basement of the building. And if you haven't seen it, it's a Cary Grant film. It's a very funny film, but I was cast to play that role. And I thought, well, let me figure out who Teddy Roosevelt is so that I can portray a man who thinks he's Teddy Roosevelt, but really isn't. And I got really interested in him. And the more I learned about him, the more interested I became. And then I started talking to people about Teddy Roosevelt. And interestingly enough, people in Oklahoma would say, oh, he came to Oklahoma in 1905, and he was down at my grandfather's ranch. And so I started finding out about his connections to Oklahoma. And eventually I wrote a show. Well, the first show was on Teddy Roosevelt in the White House. And so it was all about, I took all of his words. I didn't I didn't try to put words into his mouth. I did extensive research, read every book that he wrote, read things that are written about him, used all of his quotes and strung them together using some transitional phrasing to create a narrative for an hour-long show about Theodore Roosevelt and his time as president and how he was shaped by his childhood. But the more I found out about his Oklahoma connection, the more interested I became in writing a show that focused on that. Because he really believed in sort of what I was experiencing in Oklahoma, which is the idea that you have to be self-reliant. You've got to be willing to take risks. You've got to find a way to make yourself be up to the task at hand. And so as I understood the sort of activities he did, I rewrote the show and really based it in as if you had come to visit me in my camp out on the Panther Creek in southwest Oklahoma. And I told you all about my adventures of the day and what we were going to do tomorrow, and tied it into having met some of the important people in Oklahoma, Chief Quanah Parker, one of the last war chiefs of the tribe, one of the tribes in Oklahoma, some of the Civil War veterans who'd come out to see him, and really finding a way to bring that bigger than life personality to life on stage. But I was also interested in him because I think he was a man who had a certain amount of hubris. And at the end of his life, I think in some ways that hubris really worked against him. I think he saw himself perhaps as greater than he was, or wished that he had done more than he did. And I think he alienated some people with his rhetoric. But for me, that made him very human. We tend to look at historical figures and focus on a personality trait, good or bad. But I think if you look at the whole person, you find a complexity that you can relate to yourself. And I think I relate to that part of Roosevelt. I think, having been an actor, having been a performer, having spent time in front of people, I think there's a real tendency to feel more full of yourself than you ought to. And I think we see that I think I see that in my own self, that if I'm not keeping that in check, I could have a tendency towards hubris. And so I related to that in Roosevelt. And I think I tried to present his worldview in a sympathetic way, but also in an informative way. And I really enjoyed it. I had a great time being Teddy Roosevelt. I've not thought about doing any more stage work for several years now. Mostly because I'm focusing on my leather work, and it's the sort of thing I'm not sure I have the energy for right now, especially a one-man show. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and it's a full-time job in some ways to do that. So right now I'm happy not performing, but I won't rule it out. My wife is a director. She teaches theater. She directs professionally here in Birmingham. And if she found a show that she thought there would be a part for me in, I would be happy to do it. But other than that, I'm not sure I'm interested right now. I love to cook. I think our marriage has worked well for 42 years because I love cooking and my wife does not. I don't like washing dishes and she doesn't mind. So between the two of us, we have everything covered in the kitchen. I love to bake. I make scones every Sunday morning. I cook dinner every night. I make sausage. I love to do smoked meats on my smoker. There's a creativity in baking that, and in cooking in general, that I just really enjoy. And there's a freedom and a chance to experiment. When a meal goes badly, you can always say, well, let's call for a pizza. It doesn't happen that often now, but yeah, I enjoy it. It's a nice activity, and when you have when the family is here and the grandkids are here, we have fun baking cookies or decorating cakes together, that kind of thing. When I go to the market, I'll get there at about 5:30 in the morning and pull in to set up. And this market is great because they set tents up for us. We don't have to set up our own tent, and they'll have a table for us, and I'll bring some extra tables. And so I'll spend an hour or so getting the rest of my table set up, my table coverings, putting out my display stands, getting my items ready to go. And so by about 6:30 or 6:45, I'm set up and ready to go. We've been at markets together, most of the people at the market, so there may be 100 vendors there. But we know each other, if not by name, we certainly know each other by face. So we'll visit, we'll chat. When I eat at the market, I don't eat well at the market, because at the market there's a baker who makes the best apple tarts I've ever had, and they're just a nice size to make a nice breakfast. So I'll take my coffee with me, I'll buy an apple tart before the people start coming in, and then after that I'm done with eating for that market, because we're done by noon on that day. And so between 7 and noon, I'll be visiting with the customers who come in, making sales. Sometimes I'll get a chance to sit down in my chair for a minute and relax, but then I'm back up again. By 12 o'clock, most people have gone on home, and I pack everything up and get back in the car and come home. This summer, I've got markets up until about the 4th of July. And then I will take July and August and really focus on building up inventory for the fall. The fall is when a lot of the shows I do take place, and they're 2-day shows, most of them. And it'll be about every 2 weeks I'll be at a show. So I don't have a lot of time between shows to get inventory made so that I have more ready to sell. So I'll use July and August to really build up inventory on popular items. That way, when I get home, if I've got certain things that I need to get done, or I want to make something, or I get a custom order, I'll have time for that. Other than that, the summer will be mowing grass and taking care of my flowers and feeding the birds, and making some sausages and things like that. Talking about myself for as long as we've done today is very unusual for me. I don't normally talk about myself much, and I don't really like to talk a lot about myself. And so putting all that down on paper, I don't know, I guess I feel like, well, if I'm doing it, I don't need to write it down. I have not. And the reason for that is I'm just simply not set up for it, because I work out of my home and my shop is fairly small. I'm not really set up to take on an apprentice. And I'm not sure I'd feel comfortable sort of saying to someone, well, you come to my house and you come to my basement and you sit there and I'll teach you how to do these things. I have been asked several times if I would take on an apprentice, and I've done some leather work teaching, but I've always told people, I'm available if you want to do a Zoom thing with me and ask me specific questions. I'll do that with you. I said, but I'm not willing to take on an apprentice per se.
Have you thought of adding another type of medium besides leather, for example, paint or draw or things like that?
I have. I've spent a lot of time trying to be faithful to sort of that Western tradition, the Western heritage, so that, you'll see a lot of this kind of work that might appear on saddles and things like that when I'm tooling. But I've really gotten interested in, can I use dyes to bring more color to my work and to bring a different sensibility to what I'm doing. I did some of that with, I've done some work with leaves, oak leaves, maple leaves, and I've got some images that I can put in the Dropbox for you that have the finished products. But on this one in particular, I'm going to try to get out of my comfort zone quite a bit and use some spirit dyes and some acrylic paints to really try to work that sunflower into something a little more realistic in terms of color than what I normally do. And so that's why it's on such a large piece of leather. I'll be experimenting with colors on this piece before applying them here, because each piece of leather takes things differently. Because I'm really comfortable with the dark colors, the browns, the natural leather colors. Not so comfortable with the brighter colors, but I think I need to become, just for me, it gives me something to learn, which is part of what I like to do. I like to keep learning more about leather work, more about what I can do, how can I express myself, and if I have an idea, how can I make that become real? So I want to learn that, I want to accomplish it, and then I want to move on to a new thing, which I think is just part of my personality too. One of the quotes I love that Teddy Roosevelt says is keep your eyes on the stars, but keep your feet planted firmly on the ground, which is, it's his way of saying have great aspirations, but always try to ground yourself in reality. Realize that there's hard work that's going to go into achieving those great things. We often hear as artists and as makers, if you're doing what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And I disagree with that sentiment. I think if you're doing what you love, some days are going to be really, really hard work, even if you're doing what you love. There are some days I don't want to go down to my studio. There are some days that I don't want to look at leather anymore. And it's not often. And I force myself to go down and do at least a thing. And then I'll do another thing. I think for me, it's more about my aspirations. I can't achieve great things without hard work. And also about, to sort of bring it back to that sense of blessing. I feel like God gave me an intellect to use, and I used that for years and years as a teacher and shared what I knew about broadcasting and creating media and communicating, and I really enjoyed that. But he's also given me the ability to use my hands. And I think I find the most reward on the days when it's hardest to go to work, because that's when I have to really focus on why I do what I do, on the fact that I've been given an ability to create things that bring meaning to other people. And that's a real blessing. And if I go at my work with that focus, then I find it much easier than to continue on to the next thing and the next thing that day until I'm not thinking about, I don't want to be here. I'm thinking about, okay, now let's see. It's time to get stitching. Let's get these stitch lines just right. Let's get this, everything done. Let's come up with a new design. So I find a sort of renewal in my way of thinking when I try to put things into perspective for myself. And so for me, that's the sort of inspirational thing, is realizing where my abilities come from, realizing that I can impact other people, and understanding that at the end of the day, I can achieve things if I really will keep my feet on the ground and work for them. I'm tired of so much bad news, and so my reading, my personal enjoyment things tend to try to focus more on people being nicer to each other. I like to read novels that talk about good people trying to do good things, and it's not helpful to focus on a world that's so full of negativity. I think, for me especially.